Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm David Cortright here at the Kroc Institute, and welcome to this event to launch the new book and have this conversation about the meaning of the book and some of the key ideas in it. Joining me, Lisa Schirch and Ann Mische, and they'll offer some comments. So I'll offer a few minutes, 10, 15 minutes of kind of an overview of some of the important points to their comments and reflections and responses. And then we'll open it up for questions. And I think we'll probably break for the reception a little early, about 5:15. So the plan. So again, thanks for being here. There were many considerations that motivated the people who protested against this war, but there was one overriding, unifying concern: to save lives, to prevent the killing and the suffering of innocents that always accompanies war. And one of the most rigorous scientific studies that was done of Iraqi mortality after the war by the inter-college group at the University of Washington, led by Amy Hagopian, did a study that was published in October 2013, in which they conclude that approximately 500,000 deaths are attributable to the direct and indirect consequences of the US-led war and military occupation. So I think we should pause just for a moment as we begin some reflection on so many lives lost. Thank you. We tried to warn the government of the bloodbath that would follow, that war in the Middle East would lead to more terrorism, not less. It was the largest, most unprecedented anti-war movement in history. February 15, at least 10 million people in 600 cities around the world. Many of you have seen the film We Are Many. There's vivid footage of 1 million people that day in London, and perhaps 3 million in Rome, and 1 million in Barcelona and in Madrid, and so many cities around the world. And it continued right up to the day of the invasion. On the eve of the invasion, there were thousands of candlelight vigils around the world. In Washington, there were thousands of people out on the Washington Mall. But it seemed to have no impact. As Jonathan Schell poignantly wrote in The Nation a few weeks later, the candles in the windows did not stop the cruise missiles. And so much of the conventional wisdom is that the war had no impact. It was a waste of time. And I would like to dwell on this and point out why I think that's erroneous. There are a lot of other aspects about the book that I hope we can talk about in terms of how the movement evolved, the many coalitions in the US and internationally, the very substantial strategic communications efforts of the movement, trying to counter that of the White House, the many different faces of the movement, the constituencies from religious communities to people of color, women's groups, the big role of dissent within the military among soldiers and veterans. But I want to really focus in on this impact. And my proposition is that movements always have an impact, however big or small. Rebecca Solnit is someone who I quote a lot in the book, and she has a phrase that I think is absolutely right. It's always too early to calculate effect. And if you think about this battle that was going on in 01 through 03 against the war, it was a battle for public opinion. The Bush administration consciously manipulated the fear and the anger and the anxiety of the American people after 9/11, tried to link Saddam Hussein to 9/11. You know that a few months in the fall of 02, the polls showed that 2/3 of Americans believed that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. despite the overwhelming, unequivocal view of the US intelligence community that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda or with 9/11. But the administration consciously manipulated. And Scott McClellan, who was the White House press secretary, in his book says there was a conscious campaign to, quote, aggressively sell the war. And you remember, there was the whole WMD gambit, the infamous WMD, which was chosen not because it was plausible or had any facts behind it, but because it was an effective way to scare people. It was guaranteed to get people's attention, especially that soundbite, thoroughly misleading soundbite that Condi Rice and others kept saying, the first sign of a smoking gun may be a mushroom cloud, a nuclear mushroom cloud. Very effective, completely false. So it was a constant battle for public opinion. And the movement was countering at every step. And we here at the Kroc Institute, George Lopez and I and Scott and Alistair Miller at the Fourth Freedom Forum and others were producing studies showing that we had looked at all these inspection reports from the United Nations. All those WMD had been found and dismantled. There was no evidence of any of it. But it kept on going, and we were not the only ones making that point. And if you look at what was happening in the White House, I read through the memoirs and I looked through Bob Woodward's books, Bush at War and the first plans for the war. You can see that while Bush was saying he's not going to listen to the protests, he said, I'm not going to be influenced by what he called a focus group, 15 million of people in the streets. But in fact, they were worried, and he was in a big hurry because the window of public opinion that they had manipulated to create was narrowing. And in Woodward's book, there's a really interesting conversation between Bush and Condi Rice when he's talking to her and says, the campaign isn't holding, as he put it. The consensus is, quote, beginning to fray. Quote, time is not on our side, unquote. And the closer it got to the date of when he wanted to invade, the more worried he became. In a meeting with the governments of Spain and Portugal, he said, public opinion won't get any better, and it will get even worse in some countries like America. So he was really in a rush to move ahead. And as part of that, they also deceived the public about the nature of the war. Remember how they lowballed the military. They kept saying, well, we don't need that many troops. The military said we need 450,000 troops to take on what you've asked us to do, to come in there and occupy this country. They gave them 160,000. There was no planning or preparation for the occupation, which Bill Burns and others in the State Department were saying would be a monumental task, because they couldn't afford to acknowledge the kind of war that was actually about to start for fear that this would empower the opponents and the critics. But these decisions that were made, they're politically motivated decisions that were contrary to the advice of all the military and security people, were made for these political reasons, and they effectively doomed the mission. And we know that the war was a catastrophe. And in my research, I found the US Army's study of the Iraq War. It's published in 2019 at the Army War College. It's a very revealing study, especially the concluding chapter. And they talk about the Iraq War as a strategic defeat in the United States. The United States was not able to achieve its goals. So in a way, unexpected and strange sort of way, the movement undermined the effectiveness of the war. Now, if we look more broadly at the international picture, at the international movement, I think the impacts are even clearer. As we know, the only country that really went along with the United States and sent significant troops was the United Kingdom. Bush assembled this so-called coalition of the willing, but it was a threadbare arrangement from the very beginning. No countries provided substantial number of combat troops. And at the end of the war, if you look at the casualty figures, 93% of all the casualties were American troops. And again, going back to this US Army military history of the war, they said the coalition was largely unsuccessful. It had no operational impact. And what this meant was that Bush was unable to internationalize the war. And there was this ongoing debate at the UN, as you know. The administration went to the Security Council because the Brits demanded it. And twice they sought authority from the Security Council for the use of force, for that language, all necessary means. And twice they were turned down. In November, when there was the resolution to resume the weapons inspections, and then in February and March, right before the invasion, when they went back to the Security Council, and in that go-around, there was an explicit resolution put on the table by the US and the Brits. They were only able to get 2 or 3 other countries to sign on. They couldn't even get the 9-vote threshold to bring it to a vote in the Security Council. So they withdrew the resolution. But during this time, there was this very interesting process going on at the Security Council. I remember we were monitoring it carefully, George Lopez and I. And so the administration was really twisting arms of the non-permanent members of the Security Council, which included at that time Mexico, Chile, Angola, other countries. And in Bush's memoir, he talks about talking to these presidents, asking them to support the war. And the president of Chile is really in a tight spot. And he's saying, but Mr. President, I have 80% opinion polls against this war. I have people marching in the streets. I'm sorry. And very significantly, Canada opposed the war and refused to participate. As Prime Minister Chrétien said at the time, it was the first time when the US and British troops went into battle that the Canadians were not there alongside them. And why was that? Because there was this massive, overwhelming protest going on in Canada, 70–80% polls opposing any Canadian participation in this war. And as Parliament was gathering to decide on the war in February and March of 2003, hundreds of thousands of people were protesting outside in Ottawa, freezing cold. That's when there used to be real winters. And so it was a historic moment that's written about in some of the journals. So Chrétien had basically already made up his mind he wasn't going to go along. So he comes before Parliament and explains that Canada will not be joining in this war. And there's a great cheer. All the backbenchers, everyone in Parliament is positive. And outside in the street, people are overjoyed. And the same drama, of course, went on in other states. Turkey, Germany, Spain, other states never joined in, and other parts of the coalition rapidly left over time. So we prevented the internationalization of the war, and in a certain way, we were interacting with the UN Security Council to prevent the US from having authority to go ahead. And we're often thinking that the UN is it's a failure that has not been able to live up to its peace mission, which is generally true. But the one thing the UN has is the international legal authority to confer the right to use force. And it was twice asked to do this in this case and twice denied, which was the first time the US really tried to push the Security Council to do something and was unable to get it. That's significant, I think. So there's important ways in which we can see that the movement really had an impact. I have a whole chapter in the book on protest and politics, in which I get into social movement theory about, what is a movement? Is it only in the streets, or is it also in the lobbying and electoral campaigning? But as you know, many of us did get involved in electoral and lobbying efforts. In 2006, the Congress shifted to the Democrats. It was a significant defeat for the Republicans, overwhelmingly because of the Iraq issue, according to all the polls. And those of us who were out campaigning could see it, going door to door. And then the junior senator from Illinois picked up on this idea. He had been one of the few politicians to speak out against the war. And obviously, this is what Obama rode to the White House. It's what got him the nomination and got him to the White House for the general election. I'm not suggesting Obama was a peace candidate by any means, but on the one issue that mattered most, he said he would withdraw from the war in Iraq, and he did. So overall, I think we can say that the movement had impacts, that movements really do matter. And I think I'll just close my remarks with posing the question I think that all of us have is, where is the accountability? These politicians in our country and in the UK acted, and 500,000 people died, not to speak of all the other chaos that followed with ISIS and the internal violent extremism in Iraq. And no one's being brought to the International Criminal Court or any accountability, really. But let me close and ask Ann to offer some comments.
Okay, great. Thank you, David. So hi, everyone. I'm Ann Mische. I'm an associate professor of Sociology and Peace Studies here at the Kroc Institute. So first, let me say that I deeply appreciate the opportunity to read this book. As we were commenting just now, it really felt like a walk back in time, not always in a good way. Sent me back into the grief and the confusion of the 9/11 period. This growing fear that it would lead not only to a dumb war in Obama's terms, but a destructive and counterproductive period of prolonged violence and backlash, which it did. I didn't have a television in my home in New Jersey on 9/11, but I remember going upstairs to watch the footage at the home of my neighbor, who was a local law enforcement officer. And I remember that even at that initial moment, my neighbor was fuming that Iraq was behind us and that we needed to bomb Iraq out of oblivion, just like 9/12. I remember trying to gently push back and say that I didn't really think Iraq was involved in this. And he looked at me like I was crazy or naive, or both. I also remember attending one of the huge protest marches in New York City. I got into my ethnographer or protest mode, and I spent time like walking up and down like this. This massive columns of people that were walking through Midtown. And I reflected that I hadn't seen such a large crowd at a protest, since the disarmament protests of the late 1970s and 80s, which not coincidentally, David also helped to organize. So, clearly there's a pattern. David is literally a veteran peace organizer, and he knows what he's doing and what he's talking about. So the book contains insider storytelling, careful historical analysis, deep normative commitment, and pragmatically grounded cheerleading for those of us who are committed to both scholarship and action towards constructing a more just and peaceful world. So it's a rich and substantial book. So you might think that David could just like tell these stories, share the stories like over a beer, and then turn it overnight into a book. But that's not what this is. So I mean,
it's a little bit like that.
But it is fun to hear how all this looked from David's position on the ground at the intersection of a complex coalition. But this is also an extensively researched book, so it's no easy task to compile this kind of information. He talked about the detailed unfolding of coalition building and protest events. He fills us in on the intricacies of the debates within the administration, the responses of many different foreign leaders, media campaigns on both sides. He documents at length the sometimes nuanced and very hard to see ways in which the movement had influence, on public opinion, on leadership strategy, on policy negotiations. He also got Noam Chomsky to blur the book, and he got one of the most prominent social movement scholars, David Cortright, to write the foreword, which speaks to both his political and his analytic credibility. So kudos to David on his 140th book. Give or take a few. So now, as a social movement scholar, I wanted to pull out 3 points in David's approach to telling this history that I especially appreciate. First, I really appreciate what I'm going to call his full field approach to organizing. So David clearly has a position in the field in which he feels most comfortable, which is at the intersection between the broad-based grassroots coalition building of United for Peace and Justice and the media savvy mainstream messaging work of Win Without War, and the emergence of digital activism via MoveOn.org. At the same time, he has an appreciation for the much more critical, and I mean, they're all critical, but the more confrontational groups to the left with their roots in the global justice movement, their deep critique of capitalism, suspicion of state power, and their more horizontalist and autonomous forms of organizing. He recognizes that in order to build a movement with the reach and visibility and persuasiveness of the anti-Iraq movement, anti-Iraq war movement, you need all of these different kinds of groups organizing. They're articulating different positions in the field, even if they don't always agree with each other. And I like to call this articulation at all points in the Gramscian sense. David is well aware that for movements of this size and urgency, we cannot be purist or exclusionary in our choice of allies. So second, I appreciate David's attentiveness to the dynamics of inside or outside our coalitions. And David and I have talked about this a lot. While he shares the exhilaration of massive popular protests and the pressuring potential of the party in the streets, he also knows that massive marches and street protests are not enough if you want to change policies. He shows us the ways in which anti-war activists engaged in legislative lobbying for measures first to prevent and then to end the war. He shows how key movement leaders, especially in Win Without War and other politically connected groups, took advantage of what social movement scholars call political opportunities. That they cultivated allies in Congress, they took part in electoral campaigns, they built grassroots pressure through town halls and local civic organizations to kind of keep the pressure up on decision makers as they made decisions on policies that either supported or contained the anti-war effort. So we should note that for David, this appreciation of institutional politics is actually a form of critical position taking in relationship to some of his comrades in the full field described above, who are much more skeptical and even hostile towards state policymaking with its bargaining, half measures, concessions to powerful interests. David would argue that neither street protests nor institutional pathways are adequate alone. Rather, you need them to act in what he calls a creative dialectic between insiders and outsiders. Now, this is really hard to do, but David makes a persuasive case for why it is important. And third, I really appreciate David's attention to the more nuanced, unanticipated, and longer-term ways in which social movements have an influence. And he talked about a lot of these just now. While the massive anti-Iraq war movement lost, in that they did not stop the war or the massive loss of life and the expanded regional conflict that resulted, he shows us how activists often underestimate the impact of mobilizations. He takes us through the ways in which protests in the US and across the world deeply impacted public opinion, flipping the initial strong support for the war that I heard from my upstairs neighbor. They steered many international leaders away from supporting the coalition, effectively isolating the US and the UK. They provided backing and legitimacy for the refusal of the UN Security Council to approve authorization for use of force. And as he notes, this was really an unprecedented rebuke for the US that was really made possible by the massive global protests. And they developed influential new digital organizing platforms. And they helped build the electoral coalition that eventually elected Obama. So basically here, David is combining his analytic and his cheerleading mode. He says, don't give up on protests and mobilization for change. Or to invoke the name of his most popular Notre Dame class, you can change the world, even when it seems like you are failing in achieving your explicit goals. So this is a hopeful message that I think we all need to hear today. Okay, so all of these points are laid out in wonderful depth in the book. So in addition to these appreciations, I have several questions for David that I would like him to address for us all. First, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the difficulties of coalition building in this movement and in others that you've been part of. So you acknowledge that the full field, you don't call it that, but I'm calling it that, this full field approach to organizing is difficult. But you don't really dwell in depth at how the movement was able to negotiate and persist in spite of these sometimes extreme tensions. What kinds of debates emerged? Were there particular leaders who were better at mediating these tensions than others? Were the differences stylistic, versus more confrontational versus conciliatory groups that I've kind of documented in my work on Brazil? Or were the ideological differences? Were they based in class, racial, gender, educational, or other kinds of differences? So just if you could bring us a little bit inside these debates, and tell us what lessons that you learned about coalition building, in the process. So second, likewise, I'd like to hear more about the tensions involved in building these insider-outsider coalitions. So as you know, prominent movement scholars like Piven and Cloward and others worry about movements being co-opted or tamed, kind of domesticated, when activists engage too closely with government leaders and policymakers, or when they become state actors themselves. They're drained off the streets. They lose the leverage that you get from more disruptive approaches. I know this is a real concern among many contemporary activists. There are lively debates about reformist versus non-reformist reforms, in a lot of contemporary activist groups. So I'm wondering, did you see this kind of these kinds of co-optational or kind of taming dynamics at play in the more institutionally focused activism in the movement? Or if not, then why not? All right, third question. In the final chapter, you celebrate what you call the cosmopolitan consciousness and the universalizing morality of the anti-war movement. So both of these terms, as you know, have come under critique, in recent years. So some people have raised concerns that so-called cosmopolitanism is a form of Western or Northern privilege that can run roughshod over local cultures or power struggles. Others are concerned about the imposition of a universal rights framework from the West North on the rest of the world. I'm just wondering how you would reply to these critics, just because of the really kind of full-throated defense that you're giving in this book of this approach. So I'm also wondering what similarities or differences you see between the anti-Iraq war movement of the 2000s with what many consider to be a new global protest wave that emerged after the financial crisis of 2008, including the Arab uprisings, which I know you've written about, the global Occupy movement, the Indignados in Spain, the wave of movements in the squares around the world, from Turkey to Brazil, India, Philippines, Myanmar, South Korea, Chile, Lebanon. The list just continues. Paulo Garbaldo calls this the new citizenism, and he sees a kind of blend of anti-institutionalism, citizen engagement, and kind of nationalist themes. So what's similar or different from the anti-war movement of the 2000s? Are there connections between these protest waves, or are there new elements that have emerged in the protests of the past decade? And finally, how do we understand why some of the movements, so this is kind of off track from your book, but I'm wrestling with this. How do we understand why some of these movements have taken a right-wing turn? Either through repressive action or democratic backsliding, as in Egypt or Turkey, but also the rise of populist leaders such as Bolsonaro, Duterte, Modi, and of course Trump. I'd love to hear your reflections and even advice for activists in these countries from your viewpoint and experiences as a veteran analyst and organizer. So thank you again for this really wonderful contribution to our understanding of anti-war activism as a central component of broader struggles for peace and justice. And we're all looking forward to the next several books ahead.
Thank you so much.
Forget the question. Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
I took notes.
All right. Well, I think this book is an incredible gift to all of us who teach about social movements and organizing. But it's a gift to our time too. It's a history because, this was 20 years ago. It was, we have a whole new set of crises that we've almost forgotten that moment that I think was actually one of the most exciting moments as a peace builder, to see the entire world mobilizing against a war, because it was really the first time with the internet you saw this global mobilization. And so the role of the internet playing this incredible role of on the same day, all these protests happening. So there was incredible excitement. At the same time, while there are many wars that are maybe not very logical and difficult to understand, this war was really kind of just beyond the pale of illogical. And so the ridiculousness of sliding into war and just thinking, well, we have a global movement now, so of course it's going to end. Of course we're going to be able to prevent it. And then for us not to be able to prevent it, and for hundreds of thousands of people to be killed. And we all know how the war in Iraq and Afghanistan ended now, which is $6 trillion later, hundreds of thousands of people's lives gone, and two countries that are going to take a very long time to recover from the shock and awe bombing that we saw those first few days, when our bombs in the US, our taxpayer dollars, were spent annihilating buildings where families were living. So as a peace builder, I approached this book as a gift to remember what it was like, why we're excited, but also to think about, why didn't we win? And so this is my question. What were the obstacles to us preventing this war? And you actually outline them. And so they're scattered throughout the book, but I'm gonna comment on the reasons why we didn't succeed and what we need to do in order to make sure we can do better as social movement organizers in the next case. I think it's interesting that the PAM team is here today, the Peace Accord Matrix team. I see a number of you in the audience, because really, David was on the inside of a peace process between these different organizations to negotiate a movement, which is really, it happens all the time in social movements. You need to have negotiation, sometimes mediation, often between people with pretty big egos who are trying to lead an effort, right? And they have a lot in their personal at stake, being the savior, being the next Gandhi, the next Martin Luther King. So you end up having this competition, which is very unhelpful when you are trying to get coalitions to form. And I really liked your chapter because I knew those people intimately. I was actually called in as a mediator to bring some of those people together so that we could have a protest on the same day. Didn't end up happening, but you have to realize that so much energy goes into just people's egos and trying to get people on the same page. I hope we have learned better. I think the movement for Black Lives now has like 400 organizations that have come under one umbrella. And that movement here now, which is the largest social justice movement in history, has done a lot of work to build relationships and to use dialogue internally within the movement so that they are strong enough to have sort of a unified voice in moments of crises. So I think that as we teach our students here at Notre Dame about social movements, and in my class on strategic peace building, I emphasize a lot, you're not always negotiating between the FARC and Colombian government or at the national level. Sometimes you're using these little processes of mediation to get this NGO working with that church group, and to say, yes, you have real differences and you're not going to have everything in common, but trying to have purity in a movement, you have to figure out where your common ground is and what you're going to be able to do together, and then have grace and acceptance and tolerance for where you're not going to agree on. The second big lesson that I took away from this book is wow, how much the media really just took us along this road. I mean, we knew at the time, there's been a critique for many years that journalists, the New York Times, the Washington Post, were not publishing independent investigations on the claims of the White House that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. These stories were just printed citing government sources, but not actually checking them. There wasn't this investigative journalism that we really need in order for making informed choices. And so, you know, there's been much written on the history of news and journalism and social movements, but I think this is a huge case of where supposedly independent journalists pushed a war on us, convinced too many people that it was a good idea without the evidence. And then they later did apologize at the New York Times and the Washington Post that they had made claims, they had cited people, that it was government propaganda and there were false things published on behalf of a larger political case. So our media was not independent. We need to pay for independent journalism, and we need to be able to amplify that in the run-up to a war. So yeah, I think you cited the percentage actually in the book of pro-war experts that were on all the nightly news, in the newspapers. It was just this overwhelming journalistic argument in support of war. And then of course, once the war began, the Defense Department required any US journalist who wanted any sort of access to embed within military units, so that they were again just getting one side of the story. They weren't allowed access to go interview other Iraqis. And so you got this very different media output. You know, knowing people in the Pentagon, I know that was very deliberate because of what had happened in Vietnam, where they felt the media had gone rogue and turned the American public against the war. So the Defense Department has thought very clearly about how to get on top of these things. I don't think peace movements are fully prepared to respond to this in the future. So I think we need to learn this lesson from this book. The third lesson is about just our political process in the United States. And really, you know, for many years, the Republican Party in particular has been trying to emphasize executive branch power so that the president can declare war without a lot of congressional discussion and just sort of bringing Congress along. I think the book really points out how fragile our democracy and how limited our democracy really is. And actually, if you think about it, it was really the election between Al Gore and George Bush, and the inability for us to have ranked choice voting, you know, which is entirely technologically possible for our country to do. If ranked voting had been in place in Florida, in the whole country, would we have had a president who had taken us to war and pushed it? Whereas the other candidate was focused on climate change. And when you think about the historical fork in the road that election was, with third-party candidates pulling significant votes actually from both sides, would we have had this war? Would we have spent the last 20 years addressing climate change? We don't know, but we do know we need to have more of a political voice, because we were having mass protests and our political leaders were not responding to that. So it was only Barbara Lee in Congress who voted against the war, one person. And our other political leaders did not reflect the mass protests that were happening in, you know, so many villages and towns across the United States. So this is a failure of our democracy. It's the problem of social movements in the future. There was political jockeying for midterms, the conflation of patriotism with 100% support, no room to question US foreign policy. You do an excellent job of all of this in the book, talking about these political processes that led so much of Congress to just go ahead and say, all right, well, we can go forward with this war. And then lastly, I think the lesson for social movements going forward is just the psychology. You know, the journalists were able to take us along because we were traumatized by 9/11 and we didn't know what else to do. We had not, as peace builders, put forward really clear policy alternatives. I think the hope here at the Keough School of Global Affairs, with its emphasis on policy, is we are trying to teach an entire generation of new students about policy, about how to go into governments and make cases within policy language. And so I think that at least here at Notre Dame, we have learned the lesson that we need peace builders who know how to translate this and to work on policy issues. Final comment is just, you mentioned Eli Pariser and the move on and the whole tech world. It's really interesting because I work with Eli today, because Eli now is doing something very similar to me, which is trying to figure out how to use technology to build social cohesion and to use technology for dialogue and coalition building online. So it's almost like, yeah, we've both kind of moved from just strict advocacy and activism to thinking about how is technology actually going to help bridge and deal with mass disinformation so that we never have a war like this again. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks to both Ann and Lisa for those great comments, and lots to reflect upon. I don't think I'd be able to go through all of the questions. I want some opportunity for dialogue here and questions from all of you, but and I think of your questions, the difficulties of coalition building maybe is the one I'd like to dwell on. It somehow seems to be a gift that I have had over the years. I have this amazing ability to be in the room with dozens of different organizations and a cacophony that's virtually indecipherable. But what I try to do is latch on to what are the common themes. You know, there are things we all agree on, and what might be a way of presenting the message that could bring people together. And I remember at the founding meeting of the United for Peace and Justice, it was one of those meetings. There were like 100 people in the room representing about 70 organizations. Everybody had a chance to speak, and went on all day in Washington. And so I at the end, I got up and said, well, here's what I think we have, this and that. And it went over like a lead balloon, you know, they don't pay attention. But the other thing we did, though, is I had kind of already prepped a group, and we went to a Chinese restaurant afterwards. It's in the book, the famous Chinese restaurant, where Move On and the National Council of Churches and some other groups decided, well, that coalition is forming, but let's form a parallel coalition. So that's part of what I think we have to think about is you can't squeeze everybody into one single organization. And it's okay to have a couple of coalitions, as long as they can work together. That's when we decided to create Win Without War. And we thought about these big themes and the need to try to communicate more broadly to the media and to the political establishment. The other thing is, you know, how to deal with those differences, how to meet. The mediation goes on constantly. Both of you mentioned that. And I remember when we had the founding of Win Without War, the big press conference, the co-chair, one of the co-chairs was Bob Edgar, Reverend Bob Edgar, the former member of Congress and the head of the National Council of Churches. So afterwards, Medea Benjamin with Code Pink was there, and she came up and rather sharply said, why don't we need to have another coalition? And so Bob and I are standing there, but Bob very, you know, in this wonderful way, softly, but clearly said, well, you know, we're going to work together. You're going to be mobilizing people in the streets. We're going to be trying to do media communications, trying to reach elite audiences, bring in groups that may not be comfortable with all of the protests. And yeah, after about 10 minutes, she said, "Oh, okay. And we were able to work together
She doesn't usually just say, okay.
yeah, oh, very well. Been working with her a lot, but so it's just being patient to be able to talk about the differences. But, you know, and you made the allusion to the role of Pam, as Josefina will know well, and Laurel and others. You know, a lot of the times as the job of director of Pam is sort of making peace among the peace builders, you know, getting everybody to work in the same direction. Because everybody has an opinion, rightly so, but somehow we've got to create a direction and go through it. And partly it means you do have to listen to everybody and let everybody say their piece. And you need time and patience, but hopefully it can come together. But it's a key skill, and you can't just assume everyone's going to go along. You have to be willing, as I say, to listen and go to long meetings. One other point that I'll respond to what Lisa pointed out in terms of the media, the way in which the media was captured by the Pentagon. I wrote a piece recently called "The Democratic Deficit in the Iraq War." And I talked about how the press was astonishingly gullible in just buying all of this business about WMD and everything, not questioning it. Here are these two guys here at the Kroc Institute who are publishing reports and sending them around to everybody about showing that there's no evidence of WMD, et cetera. But I mean, we got some phone calls, and you know, George was on TV more than I was. He has a better voice, but it didn't get out widely enough. And part of it certainly is, as you say, that the Pentagon learned how to manipulate the press. And this goes back to Vietnam and even before. And it goes back to a manipulation of our culture and of our public opinion by the political establishments, by the national security state that was created in the United States in the wake of World War II. Military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it. So we are so militarized as a culture. And a key element of that is in which this profound confusion, and I think it's a conscious manipulation, of the idea that we respect troops who serve, and that must mean we have to support all of the ideas that are coming out of the Pentagon and the White House for military policy. And we can't kind of see that that's not true at all. That's why in all my writing, of course, it comes from my own experience, I try to talk about there are many voices inside the military who oppose this. And in the Iraq War, I mean, yes, there were all of us out in the streets protesting, but you had very distinguished senior military people. Brent Scowcroft, of all people, former national security advisor, remember he wrote this piece in the Wall Street Journal in August saying, don't attack Iraq, and going through all the things that would go wrong, which proved to be true. And several top leading generals, and there were quite a number of troops who did speak out against the war, and the veterans organizations. So, but it's a big uphill battle, and it's something that we always have to pay attention to. And I think the last point I'll make is Lisa's argument of we need policy alternatives. You know, back in those days, terrorism still is a real threat. Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. There was a real reason to be angry and upset, but there were better ways to deal with it. And you and others of us try to articulate those policies. And that's really what I think is a challenge for us here at Kroc and Keough School. And I think we need to pay more attention to this. All of the subjects we're addressing are important, but we need to think about international policy and how we can apply our disciplines of human rights and development and democracy and peace building to the toughest challenges that exist out there. If nonviolent, non-military means that are to have any meaning and value, they have to be able to address the toughest questions. And that's a task that I hope we can continue to apply ourselves to and help to build these movements that can make that possible. So again, thanks to both of you. And we have about 25 minutes or so, 20 minutes. So I'd like to open it up for comments, questions.
just wanted
Okay.
to know about,
Sure.
with the Iraq war, how much was George Bush involved? Or was it just mostly the people that made it happen?
Oh, no, Bush was centrally focused. It was from the very beginning. 9/11, the day after 9/11, he started talking to people. And there's an article that I found in my research by Bruce Rydell, who was in the White House staff. And he was standing around while Bush was calling world leaders. So guess day two after 9/11, he calls foreign leaders, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Tony Blair. And he says, I think Iraq was involved. I want to hit Iraq. And Rydell says, Blair was audibly taken aback. The Crown Prince said, but Mr. President, but this tells you. And Rumsfeld, the day of 9/11, told his staff, and again, we have this in the record, find everything you can on Saddam, good and bad, whatever, send it to me. But this was driven by Bush. Michael Mazar has written an important book on all of this, on the decision to start the war, a 2019 book, and Blind Faith is, I think, something that I have the title in there. But he's basically seen it as a religious zealot commitment somehow in Bush's mind.
But Cheney was feeding him a lot.
Yeah.
It is hard to say, I think, how much was Cheney talking into Bush's ear and Bush is doing things, so.
Yeah, it's surely, but Bush was at the heart of it and pushing it, yeah. Comments, yeah.
So we have an election in 2024 and things shift. Could this really happen again, David? Could this really happen again?
Yeah, I don't see, unfortunately, it's sort of your question about what are the obstacles to this happening again. And institutionally, we're still in a situation where the decisions on national security policy are made by a very small, narrow elite. That the members of Congress who weigh in on this are often as right-wing or more than the president. And by and large, there's little congressional oversight of national security policy. And if anything, we're more militarized because of the Ukraine war. There's a just struggle against Russian aggression, but becomes a vehicle through which there's a further militarization, not just here, but even in Europe and beyond. And that's a really dangerous part of this whole response to Russia's attack. You feed the machine. And this is, it's an institutional political behemoth that we have in our society that has a life of its own. That's what it means to have a national security state within the state that is still not subject to democratic control.
How you spoke about the military is able to manipulate the press. So our press today is so very confusing. Or at least for me, and now I'm not sure how I feel about it at all. And I'm just wondering is it still, the military is still able to manipulate the press, and what is how has the press changed? And what kind of role is the press have going forward, or can it have?
Maybe Lisa has some thoughts on
I
that.
do have some thoughts.
Yeah, why don't you start?
One of the good things, if anything good came out of the war, is we have an entire generation of top military leaders who are now holding back the US from going to war because they realize. So I was actually at the US Army War College when they did their debrief of the Iraq War, and it was pretty brutal. They were very honest with themselves. I was sitting at the table with the World Council of Churches and a couple people from the UN. We were all like, there's just no joy in saying, we were right and you should have listened to us. There's no joy at all saying that. But the US military did debrief and learn all of its lessons. And I think they restrain Congress now from going to war more than they did in the past. I think we have a large group of military leaders who are much more conservative and realize these are not 6-month or 3-month wars like Bush said it was going to be. So that's a good thing that came out of it, is that I think the military is more conservative and not thinking about this. But in terms of the military, the Pentagon has, a huge office in Hollywood. They're embedding this in films constantly. The architecture for NATO calls it cognitive warfare when Russia does it to us, when they use the media, both news and entertainment, to shape public opinion. But the reality is we have cognitive warfare happening in our own country to generate public opinion. So yeah, I think the situation is dangerous.
Yeah. Just a quick comment on that. I think you're right. There's a concept of military restraint that's out there, which is widely accepted in the military, and that's good. And even back in 2003, this was not a war the military themselves were pushing. And I remember we used to have these regular dialogues here on campus with the ROTC commanders, and Professor Powers and others and I were part of those. And during the run-up to the war, we often talked about Iraq, of course, and you could tell right away they were just not gung-ho about this. So one time I said, okay, well, and they were always off the record because they're serving colonels and captains in the military. We say, okay, if it's your vote, go or no go, what do you think? And we went around the room, and all of them, except for the Marine Corps colonel, said no. So, and I think that's probably still the case today. And the fact that you have General Milley is the one who's saying, in this Ukraine thing, yeah, the Ukrainians, we help them, but there ought to be some negotiated policy here. We have to figure out a way, how does the war end, which is my own view. And he's sort of been slapped down a bit by the White House, but that's a very thin reed on which to lean. We need constitutional political systems that somehow constrain military power in this country, and see this as not anti-military at all. The military would welcome this, and certainly the rank and file troops. They understand, and they're doing their duty, and they don't need to be glorified. They just need to be respected and given benefits when they get out. So. Yes, Julia.
I want to pick up a little bit on the Ukrainian war and the similarities of it between that war and the Iraq war. And did we learn anything during the Iraq war that our government could apply to the situation to help stop Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a tough issue. Well, certainly there's a direct parallel, sadly, that the Iraq war was an act of aggression, a violation of international law. The supreme crime of war is aggression. And this is the judgment of the Nuremberg trial in 1946. It's the supreme crime that carries within it all other crimes that would follow. And that's what Russia did as well, an act of aggression against another sovereign country. Beyond that, I don't see a lot of parallels. It's a different kind of war entirely, of course. And I don't know that we've really learned much from Iraq that would help us here. In Iraq, there was no attempt to negotiate with Saddam Hussein at all. We're just going to take him out. And that's what Putin thought he would do to Ukraine. I think there are issues here in terms of understanding the role of civil society, something we've come to understand in Iraq. It was civil society that was saying, no, stop, this is going to be a disaster. Nobody listened to us, but, well, I mean, within limits, but they weren't listening enough. And I think if you look at the Ukraine war, civil society is an important voice that's not being recognized and should have more of a role. In Ukraine, there's a lot of humanitarian groups. There are some pacifists, conscientious objection groups. There's a huge wave of non-cooperation with the Russians, of sabotaging the Russians, of feeding information to the Ukrainian forces. This is a crucial factor in the war, and one of the reasons why it seems extremely unlikely that Russia can control Ukraine. And in Russia itself, and this is one of the things that worries me a lot, is Yeah, so we're all focused on Putin as a tyrant, evil person starting this war. And we therefore focus the hatred on Russia itself and on the people of Russia. And yes, many of them do support the war, but many do not. And despite the incredible oppression and censorship and rigid police state methods that the Kremlin is imposing, there's a lot of people who are speaking out against the war inside Russia. Look at probably 1 million young people have left, professionals, skilled professionals, and more will leave, I'm sure, in the coming months. So there's hope there, I think, and we have to figure out a way to oppose Kremlin policy, oppose this war, help Ukraine as we can, but also figure out how we dialogue with and support the positive elements within Russian civil society.
Can I extend one of my questions?
Yes.
So, just because you have also written about the Arab uprisings and the protests in the squares and after the global financial crisis, I'm wondering just what were your thoughts would be comparing the anti-Iraq war protest to this more recent global protest wave? What are there continuities, or are there points of difference?
Well, I can only comment on the Egyptian movement and now a little bit the recent Iraq movement, civil society movement, the October 2019 civil uprising in Iraq. But in Egypt, it seemed to me that had so much hope. The people's movement in January and February of 2011, but they made a fatal mistake, I think, which was to not see the possibility of working in coalition with the moderate Islamist forces. The Muslim Brotherhood was guaranteed to win any election that took place in Egypt. It was by far the most established organization. The secular movements that started the revolution in Egypt were from the youth and smaller groups, never had a big social base. And yes, there are very reactionary, extremist elements in the Muslim Brotherhood, but there were also a lot of moderate elements. We went over there a couple of times, did research, Imam Shaheen and I from the Kroc faculty at that time. And we talked to a lot of, especially the younger youth movements of the Brotherhood, were moderate and open. So there, I think, you have to work with people who are not completely secular, not Western oriented in their human rights values, but who are against dictatorship and were committed to democracy. They did have an election. And especially when the Tamarind movement, which is where they joined with the military to overthrow the government, I thought that was really unwise because there was elections coming up in another 6 months. And Morsi's government was becoming a little power hungry. And it was unpopular, and maybe the elections would have shown some new trends and some hope for constraining the Islamist hardline positions. Anyway, the result was a complete tragedy. That's what little I know. It's kind of a window into the Egyptian movement. Looking most recently at Iraq, there's been a tremendous elevation of civil society movements, actually led by women in many respects, and the big protests in October 2019 when they had their own sit-ins in their Central Square and Tahrir Square in Baghdad and other cities. And now they're asking, okay, now what do we do? We have public opinion. It's really shaken up the political system. Even in the Shia parties, the youth wing of the Shia parties seems to be more open now. And they're trying to figure out how can they translate a lot of power from the street into the parliament. They have an open parliamentary system, and it's pretty responsive to shifts in public opinion. And they're debating this right now because it's not part of their culture. They're good at camping out for a month in the streets, protesting. They've never had a government that they don't really trust it, but that at least is somewhat flexible and responsive. So I do think it's that you have to be able to play in coalitions. You have to be able to engage in conventional political systems, as limited as they are, with very minimal advances that don't get you very far and certainly are far short of your demands. But you stay engaged and try to keep pushing. That's a hard process for movements to be able to undertake and for activists to be able to follow. Maybe I'm told the reception will start at 5:15, so maybe we have time for one question, or we could break early. Yes, please.
You mentioned earlier that there has been a lack of accountability for the Bush administration and other individuals involved in starting the war. And you mentioned that potentially you'd like to see the International Criminal Court get involved. So I was just wondering what kind of accountability we would actually see if there was some. I mean, it's so much later, it's so long ago. What can really be done to see that out?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, I don't anticipate or would want to advocate for the International Criminal Court to be involved here. It just won't happen. That's part of movements, is you have to try. You know, it's good to demand the impossible in some ways, but when you want to organize, you have to have a goal that's somewhat achievable. So I don't think that's possible. You know, in the UK, they had the Chilcot Commission. This was by senior officials in 2016 issued their report on the war. Many of the activists were dissatisfied because nothing was really done. But what happened was you had a very eminent panel of establishment judges and senior officials who weighed all the evidence and then came out and said, this war was not legally justified. It was not last resort. Other possible ways of resolving the dispute were underway when the troops were sent in. Very careful and modulated language, but clearly saying that Tony Blair and his cabinet violated the law and undermined principles for the use of force. And the day afterwards, nothing changed. I mean, Blair is still around. He was actually knighted by Queen Elizabeth, you know, so, but actually in the UK, my perception of many is that Blair's career is ruined, that his reputation going down in history will be the one as he was, you know, ridiculed as Bush's poodle, and sadly that's what he was, and went along with this war. So if we could have such a process as that, where there could really be an honest hearing, a truth commission, you know, I think of, you know, after the war in Colombia, there was this tremendous truth commission. We're going to be documenting that here at Kroc. It's a wonderful project, and we know that's a key part of peace processes around the world. You never forget the atrocities. You don't let them get in the way of building peace and trying to come together again, but you have to remember and face up to the implications of what was done. That in itself, I think, would be really important, but we haven't even gotten close to that. You know.
I have one sort of related to that, a little bit of a follow-up. Did you do any looking into like what is taught in history classes currently in high schools? I mean, maybe younger people can answer that. I realize, and that's a form of accountability. What are we learning about? What are young people learning in their high schools about the war?
I don't know if Governor DeSantis has got a law to ban it yet. But I haven't looked really, but that's a good question. I wonder if it's.
I'd be curious to know. Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, people make history, and then it's also important that we write the history.
Right, and that's part of the.
That's part of. I will always see myself as a scribe for the peace movement, and
Thank you.
so it's a small.
Thanks, David, for being a scribe.